Okay, so I'd like to continue talking about the Benjamin essay. I know that there were actually two readings scheduled. Obviously, it would have been nice to, focus on the one essay last class, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and then focus on the theses on the philosophy of history today. But I really want to get through the other essay, or get through the essay we were talking about last class. I think it's interesting to really start talking about, more of the cultural aspects of critical theory. It's almost, criminal, I would say, to talk about art and not actually display any of it. So I think we'll continue along with that. I believe where we left off, we were talking, briefly about the history of painting, how photography changed painting, basically what had been almost a consistent style for almost 500 years since the Renaissance begins to radically change. And in a process of about 50 years, you go from realistic looking painting to painting that's almost that is in fact completely abstract. And it's interesting to kind of sketch out that history. Again, in reference to the impact of photography, to explain how that changed art, basically, and not just that, right? I mean, there are a number of other things that are important as well. Changes in the material techniques of painting, new types of paint being invented. Benjamin, again, is very much for a kind of materialist understanding of art, right? That's what he means in many ways by a sort of Marxist approach to art, right? Marxism is a theory that interprets the world according to a materialist way of looking at things. Marx and Engels, refer to their theory as historical materialism. Oftentimes we use the term dialectical materialism to talk about it. But again, having a materialist understanding of art is something that Benjamin very much stresses, right? He's very much against the idea of looking at art, art for art's sake. This idea that artists exist in this sort of pure realm and are either apart from society or even above society, and have no real sort of connection with things going on in the social world. Benjamin's very much opposed to that view. And I would still say that it is kind of a view that many people have. Many people, I think, do in fact view artists as people who are somehow, not a part of these social conflicts, or again, very much sort of above these conflicts. So that, so of course, obviously the development of new technologies, particularly photography, really changed the reception of art. New developments in painting techniques, new paints, in fact, being developed during that period of time. But also, I think also the sort of opening up more of the global economy is another important factor. For example, many of the Impressionist painters and painters after them as well were very much influenced actually by Japanese art, by Hokusai and various other influential Japanese artists. I think that is very much a consequence of again the opening up of the global economy that you see in the latter part of the 19th century. Many people, the term globalization is thrown around a lot today, obviously. But many people would say that, globalization, or really the first phase of globalization, really begins during this period of time, basically during the late 19th century, basically up until World War I. Japan is one of the countries that was, prior to this, fairly isolated from the world, very isolated from the world, and is increasingly sort of brought into this sort of global economic system, in large part really through the United States, right? Through you may remember from social studies class, Commodore Perry's ships, which went into was it Tokyo Harbor or something like that, and pretty much opened up Japan to the world, and really begins an extremely complicated relationship between the United States and Japan. And I mean complicated in the sense that it's gone through many different episodes, really in many ways, culminating in the worst possible conflict you could possibly imagine. But that also then exposes Japanese culture to the wider world. And I would say, argue today that, Japanese culture still seems to have a very strong presence within the world. Obviously, the popularity of Japanese film directors like, Kurosawa, Ozu, who I mentioned last class, Japanese anime, Japanese manga, all that stuff. Really, a lot of that kind of begins, during the middle part of the 19th century, and so that had a big impact as well. Like I said, a lot of these painters were also influenced by Japanese art. And again, I mean, all this fits under this idea of, understanding sort of the social origins of art. Again, there's just this idea that art doesn't just develop in a spontaneous way, or it doesn't develop in a vacuum, but it's very much, part of a social context, and that social context obviously influences art. All right, so let me go back into that. Let's go back into the PowerPoint. I also have a couple of short video clips I'd like to try to play today. See in the chat, Jocelyn says, under capitalism, it seems that creativity, art, film, music, etc., has been inevitably linked to productivity and capitalizing off whatever you do. Yeah, certainly that's an important aspect as well, right? The idea that art is less determined by any kind of artistic value, whatever that may be, and simply based upon market values, right? Whatever is popular, whatever sells, whatever is most profitable, essentially. So actually, let me go back a little bit. So just to set the stage again, let me move my camera a little bit. So this is kind of, again, the dominant style of art, basically up until the 1870s. And I would say that painting like this very much, characterized Renaissance painting going back 400 or 500 years, pretty much up until this period of time. And I'm not saying that, painting didn't change at all in those intervening hundreds of years, but there were definitely, continuities as well. One of which was, again, this sort of striving for the most accurate, realistic detail possible. That the painter was to sort of, hide their presence. The presence of the painter should be almost invisible in the way they, construct the painting. That you shouldn't see the noticeable brushstrokes of the painter, for example. And as you can tell by looking at this image, you really can't see the presence of the artist that well, other than the fact that obviously, clearly, of course, it is a painting and it was painted by somebody, but it is a fairly realistic looking image. And of course, thematically, you also see definitely a continuity here, right? Most paintings up until this period of time either were paintings of, Greek and Roman culture, classical antiquity, oftentimes scenes from mythology. This may have been a more realistic scene. This is obviously some sort of gladiatorial scene in the Roman Colosseum. Great historical events, great historical figures, anyone from Napoleon to, the famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, for example, could be an example of that. And of course, a lot of religious stuff, a lot of, Christian derived painting, right? Depicting scenes from the Bible and things like that, as well as, portraits as well. That should be another thing I didn't mention last class. Just paintings of people. Again, the Mona Lisa probably being the most famous example of that. Possibly the most, famous painting in the world. Anyway, this begins to change though, right? Again, largely through the impact of photography, it made this, ideal of striving for realism and accurate detail kind of obsolete. What's the point? What's the point of painting a realistic looking picture when you can just take a photograph? So that, and among a handful of other things, like I already mentioned, impacts of other cultures, impacts of different, the material techniques of painting changing as well. You see painting begin to change, and it starts more with something like this. So this is a famous example of Impressionism. This is actually where the term Impressionism gets its name from Monet's painting titled Impressions sunrise. This is actually painted, I believe, the same year or after this one, 1872. It looks like it says if you see in the corner, you see Monet's signature. That's either a 72 or a 73. It looks like a 72. I think this painting may have actually been completed in 1873, or at least was exhibited in 1873. But pretty much the same period of time, and a very radical contrast, right? I mean, these paintings look very different from each other. And again, all the things that used to be the ideal are now gone. Now you can quite clearly see the presence of the painter, right? You can see his brushstrokes. It's not a scene from Roman antiquity or a biblical scene or something like that. It's a fairly mundane scene, right? It's basically people on a river, a couple boats on the river, and you see the sunrise in the background. Monet, in particular, of course, was known for these landscape paintings, paintings of nature. But the idea, and I guess really where the term impression or impressionism gets its name from, is that there's a very sort of subjective aspect to it, right? It's very much Monet is trying to create his experience of seeing the sunrise through this painting. So it's becoming more about the emotions of the painter and the emotional state of the painter, rather than this sort of objective portrayal of reality. And it's really more about creating the emotions of a scene, conveying emotion through the composition of the painting. So Monet is probably the most famous example of an impressionist painting, but I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about Edgar Degas for no other reason than I kind of like him better as far as an impressionist painter goes. I think he's kind of an interesting example in that his painting does kind of straddle the line in many ways between kind of the older realist style and the impressionist style. He's almost always considered an impressionist painter. He himself kind of rejected that label. He did not like that label. He very much saw himself, at least early on, in the more sort of classically trained painters. And I think you can see evidence of that, obviously, in this painting here, the Bellelay family. This is actually considered to be Degas' first, masterpiece as a painter. And, again, it's a fairly innocuous scene. Just let some more people in to the class. It's basically a painting of a family. These were actually relatives of Degas, cousins, I believe, that lived in Italy, who he was visiting at this time. And again, painted in a fairly realistic looking style. You can see a little bit of the presence of the painter here, maybe. But why this painting is generally known is for the kind of psychological tension, the very sort of understated psychological tension that sort of comes through in this painting. Is that clear to anybody else? I mean, just looking at it, does that come through? Or is it maybe too subtle, too understated? Do you see any tension going on here in this painting among the members of this family here? Let's see. It looks like the little girl is challenging her father. You mean the one that's sitting closer? Yeah, she kind of has an interesting posture, right? And the way she's sort of looking at the father. The father is definitely, more remote from the rest of the family, right? His posture is completely different. He's obviously facing away from the family. He's kind of more in the shadows. The mother is standing there with the two daughters. One of whom is, of course, facing us. The other one's kind of facing the father. The father looks like he is reprimanding or just reprimanded someone. Yeah, that's a good point. I never even thought of that. It looks like he just got done telling them to like shut up, basically, or something like that. The mother, or the wife's face, rather, the mother and the wife. She looks very much not very happy. It doesn't look like, this is probably, look, back then people still oftentimes were in arranged marriages. When I was reading a little bit about this painting, I think that was suggested there that, this is a real couple. This is a real family, that they I think may have been in arranged marriage. Also pointed out, it may be hard to tell, but they're the presence of different generations there. The mother was actually pregnant during this photo. So you see, sort of a unborn member of the family. And actually, it's kind of hard to make out. And I'll read the comment in a second. But the painting over the woman's head is actually a painting of either her father or the husband's father. I forget which. So suggesting, previous generations as well as unborn generations. So this whole sort of sense of like like a family history that's all sort of present in this photo. And of course, one of the great things about this is that there's always enough ambiguity in that you can always make your own interpretation. I don't think there is any one definitive interpretation of this painting, even if Degas himself told you what the painting means, and I'm not sure if he ever did. Many people would argue, many critics would argue that sometimes there are meanings that are unknown even to the painter, right? That there are sort of unconscious meanings that come through. So Adrian says, based off the mother and the girls being the focus of the painting, I think they ran the household instead of the husband, as would be traditional. Yeah, that could be it. It certainly seems that they're closer. It certainly seems that the mother and the two daughters are certainly much closer. Everything about the composition of the painting seems to suggest that the father is more of a distant figure. It almost seems as if the father is being challenged. Yeah, I would say all that definitely comes through. Again, the girl in the middle, yeah, with her hands on her hips and stuff like that, and kind of staring at the father, but not directly at him, is a very interesting posture as well. So this is kind of, these are kind of the things that Degas would become known for as a painter. His insight into body language, into posture, and of course there is a real humanistic quality to this, right? I mean, this is kind of one of the major things about Impressionist painting, is that we're not just going to paint, larger than life historical figures or literally, divine figures anymore. We're going to focus on ordinary life. We're going to bring out the sort of epic side of ordinary life. That was a theme of the French poet Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire, who's very much an influence on Degas and probably a lot of these other painters as well, is that, ordinary life has this kind of epic side to it. And if you want to paint something that is epic or dramatic or whatever, you don't have to go to these great lengths. You can simply depict, ordinary people in their ordinary lives and sort of bring out the depth and complexity of their lives as well. And I think that's also very much a political thing. I don't think that can only be explained by advances in technology, but I think it's very much a part of the rising sort of socialist politics of the time, right? That ordinary people matter too, not just the elite, not just these larger than life figures. Anyway, so I'll show a few more from Degas. I'm going to try and move through it pretty quickly. But this is kind of what he was most known for. These paintings of ballet scenes, both on the stage, and I think perhaps possibly more interesting, these sort of behind the scenes looks. And here you see, this is known as obviously Dance Examination from 1874. So we've now, jumped ahead several years as well. I don't know if I mentioned that, but the previous painting painted between 1858, 1859. So still, several years before the Impressionist movement really starts to take off. But this is more during the heyday of the Impressionist movement. And here, again, you can see, Degas among this group of painters, like I said, is more in the sort of realist school than a lot of the other painters. But you can still see, the presence of the artist is noticeable in this picture. You can clearly tell that there's a human hand, putting paint down and making various brushstrokes here, right? There's no longer this attempt to kind of hide or conceal the presence of the artist. Anyway, he did a lot of paintings like this, of scenes like this. I like this painting because, first of all, you can clearly see, the compositions of it. You have a, clearly defined foreground, middle ground, and background. But what I like about it, or what stands out to me about it, is that even though it's sort of a group setting and everyone's sort of in this small little room, and obviously they're being examined, you see the dance teacher there, the little old man with the stick. He wouldn't use a stick on the ballerinas. He would use it to sort of beat out a rhythm on the floor. He was a real person too. I believe his name is Jules Perot or something like that. But what I like about this painting is that even though it's kind of a group setting And the ballerinas outwardly all fairly look similar, all more or less wearing, the same kind of outfit and stuff. You see a lot of individuality in all the different ballerinas here, right? Almost all of them are sort of doing something else. Some of them aren't even, paying attention, like the girls here in front. They're not even, looking at what's going on. Then you see people in the background talking. Again, everyone has sort of an interesting, body language and posture. So even though it's kind of a, in other words, it creates a kind of tension between this sort of group setting, while at the same time there's a lot of individuality within the group as well. And even the way in which they're lined up, it's kind of like there's another painting like this that looks very similar, but they're more sort of, almost like in a straight line. They're more sort of fragmented and sort of broken up a little bit. But again, I mean, that would be another aspect, of this kind of, humanistic ethos of the Impressionist movement, that these people, again, have their own unique aspects to themselves, that everyone sort of has their own thing going on, that again, there's this sort of, hidden layer of depth and complexity to every person that, oftentimes we don't get to see, or oftentimes comes out in, various ways. And Degas is also known for sort of, capturing, specific moments in time. And that, of course, this idea of sort of like a frozen moment in time, of course, is perfectly captured by the ballerina in the center of the picture, is obviously, in the middle of performing some maneuver. Right? I'm not familiar with all the ballet terms, but you can see what I mean by that. So again, an interesting picture, shows a lot of individuality within a group setting. So this is much more of an Impressionist painting, right? Now here you see kind of what Impressionists are most known for, right? Now you see almost this kind of like fuzziness to the quality of the image. The features of the characters are not well defined, but you can see, again, a lot of color coming through. And again, also a lot of, the body language and posture that Degas is well known for. You can see the one ballerina there with her arm up. You can see the two sort of, twirling in the air. It almost looks like their feet are off the ground, almost like they're floating in the air, in fact. Again, very interesting scene here, the contrast of different colors. And again, much more, I think, a fairly typical example of what most people think of as Impressionist painting, where again, the intention isn't to create a realistic looking scene, but to sort of convey emotion through the painting, through the use of color, through the brushstrokes, to create a kind of, ethereal kind of quality, right? Almost like a kind of like mystical quality almost to it. And this is another scene from Degas. This is the last one, and then I'll move on from him. But again, another kind of very typical Impressionistic scene, which is that, again, seeing ordinary people, seeing ordinary sort of like working class people. The woman here is drinking absinthe, hence the title of the painting, although I believe that title was added later on. I mean, what else can you say about it? I mean, her expression says a lot. the kind of weariness, tiredness of the woman here. They look very sad. Yes, I agree. But again, fairly typical of, the sort of French working class at this period of time. And again, by not a painting of, great historical figures or anything like that, but again, basically just of ordinary people. And again, not striving for a so-called realistic aspect, but again, trying to convey emotion through the painting. And even you can even see their shadows reflected off of the mirror there. And that even kind of enhances, I think, the sense of kind of alienation that you get from this painting. Obviously, alienation being a theme that we've, explored many times in this class and will continue to do so. Certainly, I think that conveys that sense of alienation in this painting. All right. So moving on. So let's move on to somebody else. Let's not talk about Degas anymore, though he is very interesting. This image, it does kind of look like this. I think the way it's displayed here, makes it a little more blurry than it should be, which is a shame. This is actually Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. And this is a painting of the Moulin Rouge, the famous dance club in Paris, very sort of, decadent, drugs, prostitution, all that kind of stuff was going on here at this period of time. This kind of is what Toulouse-Lautrec is most known for. Again, the blurriness of the image, which is somewhat in the original, again, because at this point, painters are not striving for realism, but it doesn't really do justice to it. But you can kind of get a sense of the scene. People dancing, people, drinking at the bar, people just hanging out, showing up in their best clothes, trying to show off, all that stuff. So Toulouse-Lautrec actually belongs to sort of the next group of painters who are sometimes referred to as the post-impressionists, sometimes also as expressionists, which are also sort of seen as distinct schools or distinct movements of painting. So it can be confusing. I think it probably shows you why you shouldn't get too hung up on these labels and categories. Anyway, Toulouse-Lautrec is oftentimes considered both a post-impressionist and an expressionist painter. So is Vincent van Gogh, who I'll turn to next. But the difference between impressionism and post-impressionism is, again, just sort of pushing the level of abstractness a little bit further. Right, this painting's even though you can still kind of make out figures, we're still a long way off towards totally abstract art. The abstractness, the sort of moving away from trying to depict reality and trying to, again, more convey emotion through the painting is, I think, even more evident here in this painting. Plus, it's just a fairly interesting picture of kind of Parisian nightlife during this period of time. So Toulouse-Lautrec also did a lot of advertising art through these colored lithographs. Benjamin actually mentions lithographs in his essay, sort of a step along the way towards the development of photography and a step along the way in the reproduction of art. Again, very colorful. Toulouse-Lautrec has a very unique style of drawing. His use of color is very unique. What's interesting about this is that, like I said, it's basically an advertisement. It's basically a poster for this club here known as Divan Japonais, basically the Japanese divan. And this was a famous dancer. I believe her name is Avril Goulet or something like that. The man in the picture was an art critic as well. I forget his name though off the top of my head. Anyway, though, I used to know people that would have things like this hanging up in their house. He did several of these. Obviously, I'm only showing one example of it. But it is kind of funny. It is interesting to think that people would basically hang up what is essentially an advertisement in their house as a piece of art. I'm not criticizing it either. I actually think it is very nice looking, and it is, as a piece of art, it does work well as a piece of art. But that actually is what he was going for here, and again, did a whole series of things like this, which usually show off people that would have been known in the Paris nightlife scene, dancers, things like that from that period of time. And then of course you have Van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, also sometimes referred to as a post-impressionist painter, also sometimes referred to as an expressionist painter. So the line of impressionism, post-impressionism, expressionism is, again, seems to be this sort of development or this move away, like I said, from realistic painting towards more subjective, towards more sort of emotional painting, with each movement sort of emphasizing that quality more and more. So I didn't actually, I kind of know them as post-impressionist painters. I didn't include any examples of clearly, categorized expressionist painters, but I figured this would kind of work for both. So this is, a fairly famous painting by Van Gogh, maybe not his most famous, which is probably Starry Night, or his paintings of sunflowers, but Cafe Terrace at Night. I've always liked this painting. When I was in college, people used to go to the college, bookstore, and you'd buy, a reproduction of a famous painting, right? We are, of course, talking about the reproduction of art. A lot of people I knew back, they'd go with the Salvador Dali melting clocks, who's another, of course, important painter. I did not actually include any examples of him, though. Some people would go with Andy Warhol, who's frankly a painter I never really understood the big deal about him. This is actually the painting that I went with. I just like the way it looked. I like the contrast of the light from the cafe and the night sky. I mean, that's all I can say about it. But again, otherwise, you can see more and more the kind of, the emotions of the artist that, taking more and more of a, center stage here, basically. All right. And then, of course, another famous post-impressionist painter, Cezanne. So he's very well known. I mean, most of these painters painted many different things, of many different, themes and settings and things like that. I tried to focus on the things that they're most well known for. Degas did paint other things besides, scenes of ballerinas. Toulouse-Lautrec painted many different things. Cezanne painted many different things as well, but he's probably most known for these so-called still life paintings of, apples and pears and things like that. He painted, a whole series of things like this. I believe that this is just a basket of apples. And, it doesn't look like much. I mean, to be honest, I had to kind of read up on this a little bit more and understand why this is considered such a classic painting. Whereas the other things by Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec kind of grabbed me right away, kind of quickly sucked me into it. I had to kind of understand why this is such a big deal. But basically, it is also, like I said, this idea of sort of pushing the art towards more abstract levels. So we can still clearly make out what the objects are here, right? But we're sort of approaching the point where, the form, the shape, and structure of the objects are kind of breaking down a little bit, and it's really becoming more just about the color. So if you kind of almost take a step back and don't look at it too closely, it becomes just about the series of different colors that are represented here in the painting, the greens and the reds and the yellows. Picasso, for example, who of course is very much a kind of abstract artist, although maybe not totally abstract, regarded Cezanne as one of his major influences. And I think many people sort of acknowledge that aspect of it, of sort of, taking painting, again, just slowly pushing the limit towards more abstract painting. There are some, odd things that stand out here. They're a little bit understated. If you look at some of the table, the angles of the table, they don't really make sense. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but if you look at the angle of the table directly underneath the basket and the angle of the table next to the bottle of wine or whatever that is, it doesn't really match up. And, again, it's less about painting the things in a completely objective, realistic way, and more about experimentation, more about, again, sort of pushing that boundary a little bit. Some people point out that these, cookies or pastries on the table here don't really make sense either. The top two almost look like they're kind of floating in the air, that they're not really being supported on the other side. So it may not, it may be more understated at first, but there are actually things here that are not totally realistic. And again, of course, like I said, if nothing else, certainly you can see the presence of the artist. Certainly you can see the presence of the brushstrokes being made by the painter here. One could have easily painted this in a much more realistic way and sort of, conceal that aspect and made the apples look more, quote unquote, realistic looking. But that was not really the intent of the painter here. All right, so now we've talked about Impressionism, talked about post-Impressionism. Now we have Henri Matisse and a movement known as Fauvism, which literally means in French, the wild beasts. And the reason why Matisse and a handful of other painters earned that nickname was for their radical use of color. Here you can see that, here again, we're moving even further away from realist style painting. You can still clearly, make out the figure of the painting, of course, is entitled Woman with a Hat. And you can clearly tell that it is a woman with a hat on. But no, of course, note the use of color, which I think stands out quite obviously, right? I mean, these are very it is a wild use of color. I mean, it's very colorful. Matisse, I say, is probably one of the most colorful of the modernist painters from this era. And again, it's about color, but it's also about the sort of emotions that we attach to those colors, which could be varied, right? I mean, again, there's not one definitive interpretation of things, but it's more about how the painting sort of makes you feel, and more about the painter sort of expressing his own emotional self through this use of color. And even more sort of radical example probably is this painting here by Matisse. Again, very, very vibrant, almost to the point it almost is bright. I mean, it's almost overpowering in a certain sense. Again, showing this on a slideshow on PowerPoint probably diminishes the effect a little bit, but if you could see this up close, it would probably appear even brighter, and just the very vibrant uses of the color palette, reds and yellows, and this kind of purplish or lavender color, blues. It really is almost like an explosion of color. And again, the abstraction of the painting stands out even more too. You can kind of tell that it's a painting of buildings and sort of the surrounding landscape, but the abstractness of the image is growing more and more, I would say. And then of course you get to Picasso. And I'm kind of jumping ahead. The last painting was from 1905. This is from 1932. One of Picasso's most famous paintings, Girl Before a Mirror. So actually, let me go back a little bit. So if this one's called Woman with a Hat, you can pretty obviously tell it's a woman with a hat, and despite the sort of radical use of color here. This one's Girl Before a Mirror, and you can just barely tell that that's what you are actually looking at, right? I mean, the shape of the mirror maybe is the only real giveaway that it is in fact a mirror. But obviously, we've now entered a much more sort of abstract level of art, whereas the figure is just barely recognizable, right? You can still just barely tell that you're looking at a figure of a woman. Of course, calling this realist, painting completely, defies any description there. Obviously, this is not a realistic looking painting at all. And you can, debate what is Picasso going for here. So I, this is from 1932, so I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. But Picasso was basically on the scene around the same time as Matisse. Their paintings are in fact often, compared with each other. Oftentimes, doing very similar paintings, but with very different, treatments of each. I would say probably by the early, probably by about 1905 or so, Picasso's painting, or a few years later, Picasso's paintings were already becoming very abstract, although his style would continue to evolve over that period of time. Again, obviously I don't have time to go into every single painting or every single painter. Now, inevitably, when you get to this point, this is where we start hearing people say things like, I could paint that, or, oh, my 5-year-old kid could, her finger painting looks as good as this, and stuff like that. Especially when you get to even more abstract art, like Jackson Pollock and people like that. I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, obviously, it's a kind of a dumb thing to say. It's very much a cliched thing to say. If you've ever heard a person say that before, you've probably heard it a million times. For those who don't think that Picasso could paint in a more realistic way, he can. I mean, you can actually see early examples of his painting where he is painting in a much more realist, or actually in that period of time, a more impressionistic style. But compared to this stuff, much more realistic looking. There's actually a good YouTube channel that you can look at called I think it's called Learn from Masters, and it'll basically you find a painter and it'll basically like cycle through their paintings pretty quickly. I mean, it doesn't give you really a lot of time to really focus in on any painters, but if you want to look at Picasso, you can kind of see very quickly how his style of painting evolved, and clearly, if he wanted to, yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about abstract painting as well, right? The black square, yeah. I've got some things to say about that. Although mostly I'm just looking at painters up until Benjamin's time. So again, Benjamin is writing this essay in the mid 1930s. So I would could only imagine that he's aware of all this. I'm sure he's aware of Picasso and all these other painters. A lot of the even more abstract stuff, Jackson Pollock, people like that, come out kind of after Benjamin's time. So I won't focus on them as much, but obviously people are, Mark Rothko is another one who, I think people are familiar with. But again, it is interesting to, sort of start from that picture of the gladiator scene. And then, again, in just a couple of decades, basically sort of push ourselves to the point where we get to here. And again, I could have selected an earlier example of, Picasso that would have shown his painting was abstract even, 20 years prior to this. This happens to be one of his more well-known paintings. Probably his most well-known painting overall, though, is this, Guernica. Also one of his most political paintings. So, and this is a very large painting as well. That's another thing I should say. Obviously, the scale of many of these things is kind of off, obviously, because it's being reduced to being shown in the PowerPoint. I should have mentioned that actually when I was showing that altar piece last class, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. I love that title. A very massive thing. I mean, it would have, in your average room would have, filled the room basically from floor to ceiling. Also basically, made back in, I think, 1430, 1432 or something like that. So again, almost like 500 years before Benjamin is writing his essay here. Are you talking about Guernica? It's so big that you can't fit it. Yeah. It's a very massive thing. It's a very political painting as well. Does anyone know the backstory to this? What was Picasso's inspiration here for doing this? This was actually his take on the right. It's a scene from the Spanish Civil War, basically the bombing of the city of Guernica in Spain, which was basically bombed by Spanish, forces who were being supported by the fascists in Italy and by the Nazis. And again, very abstract, but you can kind of, there are some signs where you can tell. Obviously, the man with his two arms thrown in the air looks like he's in agony. Certainly, most of the characters have a very sort of pained look, pained expression on their face. One guy is laying on the floor like he's dead. It's again certainly emphasizes the kind of tension and anguish and conflict. And even though it is very abstract, like I said, it's a very political painting at the same time. So that is kind of a taboo subject, right? Many artists don't like to think of themselves as being overly political, or again, they don't want their art to be seen in that way. They think it's somehow a degradation of art to have a kind of political message in it. Well, okay, but I mean, Picasso didn't seem to mind, right? I mean, like, and who's going to say that he's not, a great painter, unless of course you hate this kind of stuff and think that your kid could draw, do a better painting than this. Anyway, so very, very famous example of that. So there's a famous story that of course I'm obligated to tell. Who knows if it's even true or not, but Picasso, who actually lived in occupied France during the war in Paris when it was occupied by the Germans. There's a famous story of a German, military officer coming into Picasso's house for whatever reason. That's what kind of makes you think maybe this story is not true, because I don't know how Picasso would not have been dragged out of his house for what he did. But there's a photograph, not the original painting, which we already said is pretty large, but a photograph of this painting hanging on his wall. The German officer asks Picasso, "Did you do this?" And Picasso's famous response was, "No, you did," which is kind of funny if it is actually true. Basically saying that you're responsible for this horrible event, this bombing of the city, which killed who knows how many people. Kind of makes you think it probably didn't happen, because why would the German officer have tolerated any lip from Picasso? But I don't know. It's a funny story if it is actually true. And then, all right, and this will be the last painter that I talk about, and then we'll kind of move on from talking about that. Maybe sum things up a little bit, put things in a little more historical context. But Kandinsky, Vasily Kandinsky, a Russian painter who mostly lived in Germany. Kandinsky is actually the painter who's generally first credited for pushing painting into total abstraction, meaning that, you know, Picasso stuff is pretty abstract, like I said, but you can still kind of delineate some idea of a human figure in it, however distorted it may be. Kandinsky is usually credited as the painter who really took things to that next level of abstraction, where there is no recognizable human figure or recognizable natural object at all. It has literally now just become shapes and colors, basically. And I would say that's pretty much where painting has gone since then. And this is what Kandinsky considered to be his most famous paint, or his best painting, Composition 7 from 1913. So it's been over 100 years since we've sort of hit this level of abstraction. And I would say that, you know, if you look at contemporary painters today, not that much has changed. I mean, maybe, again, some of the material techniques have, probably better paints have been invented and things like that. But as far as the sort of ethos of abstract art, you know, not a lot has really changed. So an interesting thing about Kandinsky is that he had a condition known as synesthesia, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but basically it means that he would hear color, that he would associate certain sounds with color, which is a kind of an, you know, unusual thing to describe. Supposedly Degas had that as well, and, you know, various other people. It's a very rare thing, obviously, but there are, you know, a number of people that have that. I certainly don't have it, so it's a very, you know, unusual concept to try to explain. But apparently that's, I guess, the easiest way to explain it. So he would hear music, he would hear certain sounds, and he would associate colors like red or blue with certain musical melodies. And music apparently played a very big role in his painting. I mean, the title of his painting is even Composition 7. It makes it sound as if it is a, you know, composed piece of music rather than a painting. But again, interesting stuff. I don't know if, you know, do any of you hear music when you see this? You know, if so, maybe you should become a painter. This is another fairly famous painting of his, much more sort of angular, geometric. Pharrell Williams has that. Interesting. Did not know that. But again, very much abstract, right? It's like I said, at this point, you're basically just dealing with shapes and colors, geometric shapes and colors. There is no representable, you know, human quality to this as well. All right. So this is actually an exhibition. That's Joseph Goebbels, the famed Nazi minister of propaganda, and also a you know, wannabe art critic himself. This is from an exhibition of what is known as degenerate art, I believe from 1937. So the Nazis hated all this stuff. They hated all modern art. Like I mentioned last class, you know, they did have their artistic taste, but they definitely seemed to prefer more the sort of quasi-classical looking, you know, Greek and Roman stuff. And they hated all modern art, everything from Impressionism all the way up to, you know, abstract art like Kandinsky and Picasso and stuff. You know, again, I left some things out. I didn't include Surrealism, for example. If I have time to, I will talk a little bit about Dadaism, which is very, you know, in some ways similar to Surrealism, I guess. But I included separately only because Benjamin himself brings it up later on in the article, but in the essay. But anyway, the Nazis hated all this stuff, and so they actually took the fairly strange idea to exhibit this art under the label of degenerate art. I think we all know what the term degenerate means. So kind of a strange thing that they would do something like that. Apparently the show was very well attended. It had the biggest turnout of any art show in Nazi Germany during this period of time. And they would, you know, they would kind of, it may not be evident here, and I wish I knew more about the art that I could even identify the paintings here. I'm not familiar with them. but they would do things like they would sort of hang the paintings crooked. Some of them were defaced. Some of them had things written on them and things like that. And it was really a way to sort of ridicule and I guess mock these artists. And so, what I said a moment ago about people, making, dumb comments about abstract art and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not saying that you're a Nazi if you don't like modern art, of course, but there is kind of a correlation between those things, right? And there is, and I would say that most people who do, take more of a dismissive tone towards modern art, which again includes everything from Impressionism on forward, oftentimes people who are critical that do, in my experience at least, tend to be more on the conservative side of the political spectrum and things like that. So again, I'm not saying you're a Nazi if you don't like modern art, but there is kind of a correlation between that and something which Benjamin is aware of as well, in spite of the fact that the Nazis themselves often had very sort of, I would say, pretentious attitudes towards art. It wasn't like they were completely vulgar and dismissive of all art. It's just that they had a very specific taste in what they considered art. And obviously all this stuff is pretty much stuff that they hated. All right, so on that note, let me actually have a couple of short video clips I'd like to play. So I'm going to try to switch over here. I was having some problems with my computer again, but I'm actually going to try to switch over here to my web browser and see if I can play this, and hopefully you'll all be able to see it. So what this is basically 13 artists who take painting to a new level. It's a short video, but like I said, basically from that point on, we are still very much, it's been like 100 years now, and really not a lot has really changed in abstract art, in painting in general, which tends to be much more abstract. Yes, you had your Andy Warhol, and you have people like there who do different things like that. Again, like I said, I don't really get Andy Warhol. I don't really see why people make such a big deal about him. But anyway, so, if there's anything we can say about abstract art, it's that maybe, it leaves me kind of a little cold, like personally speaking. And I'm just speaking personally here. I mean, I understand that. I think intellectually speaking, I understand the sort of, again, the move towards, moving away from realistic painting and kind of like pushing the boundaries more and more. And sort of the logical conclusion of that obviously would be to get to totally abstract art, where you just have now completely turned away from painting realistically looking objects and people towards something that's totally abstract. I understand that on an intellectual level. That being said, it does leave me kind of cold lots of times. It just doesn't seem, it seems very detached. It seems like what I like about the Impressionist painters and post-Impressionist painters is their concern with humanity. I like the fact that they try to focus in on the so-called epic side of everyday life. And I like the fact that there is a kind of human concern, a human element there. And sometimes, it's not always reflecting the artist's personality either. Degas, for example, was, famously a misanthropic person, right? Not a person who was easy to get along with. And who knows what that stems from, or why that was the case. But there is, not just in his painting, but also in obviously most of these other painters that I've just briefly gone over, a kind of concern with humanity. And maybe it's the historian in me that I like the fact that these Impressionist painters are kind of leaving a historical document, even though it's not realistic per se. It is, of course, something that you can recognize, and you can make out, the figures and the settings in it. And I like the fact, I like that sort of depiction of how life was, I guess, back then. Anyway, with all that being said, let me show you this quick video of contemporary painters now. And, I won't try to prejudice people, but let's view it. I'm kind of curious to hear what people say about it. So hopefully I can play this and then expand the screen, and then you'll also be able to see it. Can everyone see this? So what do we think? Thumbs up, thumbs down, as far as this group of artists go. I'll say that, like I've already said, I think I am, I can understand intellectually speaking the drive towards greater abstraction in art. I like the end results of these paintings. I think they look really good. They're very colorful. The colors are very bright and vibrant. I'm sure there's been a continuous evolution in the commonality is the accessibility of abstraction. Interesting take on it. So you're saying that because it's abstract, it creates kind of a more common experience of things. Personally, the one in the bathroom wasn't for me. They're pretty, but yeah, waste of paint. I love the geo. I mean, to me, it's all right. So all that being said, I mean, to me, it does strike me as very like gimmicky, right? A lot of these painters, it looks like they just come up with some kind of quirky gimmick for doing their paint. And look, I'm speaking as somebody that can't paint anything or draw anything, so I have no artistic ability at all, of course. But yeah, the guy with the swing always stands out to me. I don't know. It just seems like it's more about finding some like quirky gimmick for doing your painting. It's more about the technique of the painting, right? Like actually seeing the painter in action rather than the end result, or at least that's the way I look at it. And again, I like the end, I like the end result. I think it's very colorful and interesting and stuff, but there is to me at least kind of a gimmicky kind of quality about it at the same time. And again, abstract art, it's not really new at this point. I mean, they've been doing painting like this. Granted, these colors are probably a little bit brighter than what they had access to back then, but the ethos, the ethic of creating abstract art, it's not really new at this point, right? It's been around for like 100 years, and maybe there's nowhere else that you can really go, right? Once you've sort of pushed painting to this level of total abstraction, I mean, where else can you really go? I guess. Yeah, I think about abstract art as more easily accessible in terms of its creation. Arguably, it's harder to draw a realistic eye versus the abstract material and feeling, etc. Oh, it's a very interesting take on it. I haven't really thought of it like that. But yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Again, I don't, I'm not gonna be one of those people who's like, oh, my kid could paint better than that. Just that for me, personally speaking, I think it leaves me a little cold. I guess, it's just a personal preference, but I kind of like the more humanistic aspect maybe of some of the earlier painters. But teach their own though. Nowadays colors create the work for the artist, so there isn't much in it except commercialism. Yeah, and I wonder if that commercial aspect doesn't kind of relate to this idea of having like a kind of like a gimmick, having some weird quirky way of like creating your paintings. It's a way to stand out more, right, in the marketplace of painting, where of course there probably is a lot of competition, so you have to find some way to distinguish yourself. So you come up with this gimmick basically for creating your paintings. At least that's one take on it. But again, I think it's still interesting stuff all around. And again, focusing on the material aspects, literally the different technologies and techniques that allow for art to be created is very much something that Benjamin is concerned with, right? It's not just about the genius of the artist, right? But that's part of it. But the other big part of it is what technologies are available at the time for the artist to create their work. And I think that is one thing, of course, that has continued to change. I think the paints that they're working with are incredibly vibrant and incredibly bright and colorful, and that does certainly create a very strong impression as well. But all right, so let me move on from that. So we've talked about painting, we've talked about photography. Let's talk about film, another important technology that Benjamin talks about. So, this debate over, acting on the stage versus being a film actor is something that still people talk about to this very day. And, oftentimes there's kind of a bias, I think, towards, stage acting, because you are acting, live in front of an audience. You don't have the luxury of the director yelling cut and then you get to do it 20 more times. You have to do the performance all at once. in a live atmosphere and, basically memorize your, lines basically through the entire performance, which obviously a lot of those pressures are not on film actors, at least not to the same extent. Interestingly enough, though, Marlon Brando, who of course was, one of the best actors of that generation of actors, coming out of the 1950s and stuff, who did both, stage and film, actually said that he liked film better. And I'm paraphrasing here. I saw a documentary with him once. I don't remember if this is his exact quote, but I think it's pretty close to it. But he says that basically with film, he says the face becomes the stage, which I thought was kind of an interesting quote. And I think it relates a lot to what Benjamin is saying here. Well, all right, so let me just read the quote by Benjamin. He says, the camera that presents the performance of the film actor to the public need not respect the performance as an integral whole. Guided by the cameraman, the camera continually changes its position with respect to the performance. The sequence of positional views which the editor composes from the material supplied him constitutes the completed film. It comprises certain factors of movement which are in reality those of the camera, not to mention special camera angles, close-ups, etc. Hence, the performance of the actor is subjected to a series of optical tests. So again, going back to Marlon Brando. So Brando, of course, was a very well-known stage actor, right? He debuted the performance of Stanley Kowalski, right, in A Streetcar Named Desire, which of course is one of the most famous American plays. It's a play that's still, performed to this very day. He was the originator of the role, and then he played that character in the film adaptation of it, which is also, considered a classic, movie as well. The film adaptation of A Streetcar Named Desire. So he, is someone who had definitely experience with both worlds, and everything I just said a moment ago would maybe, bias people towards thinking that stage actors are better actors, and maybe they are in some regards. But his quote about the face becomes the stage, and what Benjamin talks about with, special camera angles, close-ups, etc. What I think he's talking about here is that, there are certain things that you can do with film that you can't do in a live performance, which is basically you can see a close-up of the actor's face. And that close-up allows sort of different nuances of emotions, which really wouldn't be possible in a live performance, right? Simply put, you can't see the actor that close if you're sitting in a live audience, right, watching them on stage. I mean, you can to a certain extent, but you can't see it to that same level. Now, with the ability to give an extreme close-up of the actor's face, and there was at least one famous movie, classic movie, The Passion of Joan of Arc, by a director named Theodore Dreiser, which basically almost the whole film is just like a close-up of the actress's face who was playing Joan of Arc. I forget her name off the top of my head as well, but you can convey emotions in a way that you couldn't on the stage. And especially it actually allows, since we're commonly led to think that, film is a sort of a more vulgar art than, live acting. It actually allows for a more nuanced, portrayal. You can do more with less effort, basically, with a more minimal effort in some regards than you could, on the stage. I thought it was at least an interesting take on that, since, we're commonly led to believe, of course, that, it's the opposite. What was the difference between ritual and aesthetic in terms of art and history, according to Benjamin? So ritual is the idea that, art has played this kind of ritualistic role for millennia. I was going to say for centuries, but literally for like thousands of years, right? That's the role that art played. It was in the service of rituals, normally in the service of religion. And people believed in it, right? People literally believed when they were looking at art that they were looking at something divine. They were literally looking at the presence of God. And we've kind of lost that now, right? The mechanical reproduction of art kind of desensitizes us to that, right? We no longer look at art in that terms. So now we look at it purely for its artistic values, right? We no longer look at it as a part of ritual, but we look at it more in its own terms, you could say. And that leads to sort of a different, perception of art. Like I said, to a certain extent, we become sort of desensitized to art. But that desensitization also kind of frees us in a way, right? Because people were, literally trapped in myth and superstition because of this as well. So Benjamin looks at what again he calls famously the loss of the aura of art. The aura, again, sort of coming from this ritualistic aspect of art, as actually a emancipatory moment, something actually sort of frees us again from myth and superstition and things like that. But again, he's also concerned with artists who kind of like deify art and actually literally put art on the level of, if not literally worshiping it, to almost elevate it to the sense that it's this, pure thing that's sort of, outside of or above society. That's one way of looking at it. So let me give a couple more examples. We're running out of time here, so I'll have to cut things short. But of course, one of Benjamin's themes that he talks about is the change in perception, right, that we get from the reproduction of art and through new film technology. So I'll give just a couple of examples of that. Is this where I want to be? Yes. My screen sharing is paused. Why does it say my screen sharing is paused? Let's see what's going on here. Why does it say resume share? Oh, maybe this is what I want to be doing. Okay. All right, good. Oh, I see. Okay. So here we go. Here's an example of very early film. Okay, I'm not gonna play the whole. I'm just gonna play that little part. Did anybody get terrified when they saw the the train coming into the station? I'm sure you did not, but people actually did. And I'll just show that real quick. I'm moving faster now, but it kind of is a good example of how people's perception has changed. This is from 1895 by the Lumiere brothers, the Light brothers, a very early example of film. The first time people saw this, people became terrified because they literally thought that the train was going to like come through the screen and like, run through the, the theater where it was being played. So again, just one example of that. So he does talk a little bit about Soviet film versus Western film. And I'd like to try to play that if I can. Yes, this scene right here. Okay, so everyone can still see my screen. So this is a famous example of the film October by Sergei Eisenstein. October, or by its full title, October 10 Days That Shook the World, was a book by John Reed, who was an American journalist who was actually buried in the Kremlin, the only American to be buried in the Kremlin. Basically a depiction of the events leading up to the Russian Revolution at the end of 1917. This is one scene. This is actually fairly early on in the movie. This would have actually happened in the summer of 1917. A peaceful protest in St. Petersburg is attacked by the military. This is kind of a little bit taken out of context. So you see the scenes of the military gunning down demonstrators. There's also something going on where this lone Bolshevik sort of gets separated from the rest of the group, and he basically gets like attacked by a bunch of bourgeois women and stuff like that. It's a pretty crazy scene. So let me just play it real quick. Again, I'm short on time here, so I gotta run through this pretty quickly. But All right, so there you go. So yes, fairly effective propaganda scene. Certainly does not portray the bourgeois in a good light. Oh, Pravda is still being sold today in a similar manner to the New York Times. Yeah, that was the sort of Bolshevik newspaper back then. I didn't know it's even still being published today. Wow, I have like so many windows now. Like, let's see. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. Actually, I did. I don't have time to play, but there are other versions of the film that have different music. I like, the music here seems very much to sort of suit the tempo of what's going on in the film. Some of it, there's another version that I could have played that actually has a more complete scene, but the music was very low energy, and I don't know, I didn't, so I went with this instead. I was actually going to show that as an example of how, something like, music can change things, but apparently I have like a minute left, so I got to just move on. So let me speed quickly to the epilogue. I don't have time to go through all this stuff. Talks about Dadaism, like I said, won't get a chance to talk about this, but I'll post it in the, when I post the PowerPoint. Some interesting stuff here. It's kind of a shame I won't get to talk about it. Well, the epilogue is very interesting in that he becomes very explicitly political here, right? So everything up until now, you may have wondered, like, what is the political impact of this? And he makes some, passing reference here and there throughout the essay. But by the time you get to the epilogue, it's very much, the politics are very much, on display here. He talks about fascism, the relation of fascism to the, to art, and sort of introducing, aesthetics into politics. Many artists supported fascism, like the Futurists, which is an Italian movement of painting, which certainly could have been included among modern art. Benjamin makes several references to Luigi Pirandello, who's a famous Italian artist who supported fascism. But let me just read out this last quote. Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, now is one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is a situation in politics which fascism is rendering aesthetic. Communism responds by politicizing art. So I think that's an interesting way to end things, because what he's saying is that there are sort of two different responses here. Communism is introducing politics into art, which I think is fairly obvious, and people understand that term. What he says the fascism is doing is that fascism is introducing art into politics, which is a much more sort of confusing idea. And I don't think we'll have much time to talk about it today. Obviously, maybe it's something that we can pick up next class, but it is an interesting idea. So fascism introduces art into politics. Communism introduces politics into art, sort of an inversion of each other. And I would say, just real quick in closing, I think one of the meanings that he has for introducing art into politics is this element of elitism, that there's a sort of this elite conception of things. And all right, so that obviously fascists have a contempt for democracy and mass movements, even though they try to pretend that they are, right, that they pretend that they are a movement of the people. But all right, so that's all we have time for today. Does anyone have any questions for me? We'll actually pick up. I'm gonna also extend it also. So we'll deal with the next reading by Benjamin next week, even though that'll sort of conflict with the syllabus a little bit. All right, so that's all. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too. Take care.